Hello there. How's it going? I am here with my dear friend Barry Taylor.
Hey everybody.
We have just done a Wake festival together, and we've been hanging out. And I thought it would be good to do a bit of a conversation.
Absolutely.
So,
because we never do it.
yes,
We always say we're going to do it.
I never
and
do.
we never do it.
We don't have conversations in private either. We
No.
just sit in silence
Sit
together.
in silence like two monastics in cells.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I want to have a conversation with Barry is, interestingly, we are both practitioners. We're both interested in theory.
Yeah.
But in terms of this notion of Church of the Contradiction, or bringing in the liturgy of lack, or exploring those kinds of issues, there isn't many other people I can think of outside of yourself who have actually been doing things like that.
No, I don't think there are, which is quite... I mean, I know there are people who probably flirt
Yeah.
around or try and incorporate pieces.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that there are... I mean, could be wrong. There could be a whole network of people that
Yes,
we just don't know.
Exactly.
Like mole people doing stuff. But
Yeah.
I think that's one of the challenges with radical theology, and the thing that really needs to be paid attention to, because if you sort of think about the wave, the sort of death of God theology of the 60s, Altizer and Vahanian and those people, that sadly sort of got sidelined into the theoretical and the academic without really making impact on the broader church.
Yes.
And when you think about the fact that Altizer and the others were all active in their churches,
Yeah.
that was something that they wanted to see and was really for, if you like, it was for the church.
Yeah, Altizer very much wanted
Yeah.
to see a liturgy come out of this death of God stuff, and never was able to see that in his lifetime, really. He did it within his own denomination a little bit.
And I think today there's a similar challenge, and there are manifold reasons why I think, because firstly, if radical theology is essentially a non-confessional version or approach to Christianity and the structure of what goes on in Christianity, you can understand why it's difficult to generate a kind of response, a practical one. But if it's only theory, well, what's the point, really?
Yeah. So some of this conversation will probably be beneficial if you watch a Paris seminar that we did a few weeks ago that's on my YouTube channel. If you want a bit more of the kind of theoretical background.
The Paris one.
Yes, the Paris one. Yeah. So we talked about this over about 4 hours. But we'll get into a little bit more of the practical stuff. Just a little plug before we do that is actually, part of what I want to be doing, this is in the next decade of my life, is to get back to creating what I call communions, liturgical spaces to enact some of the theory that I've been exploring over the last 30 years. And one of the things I'm doing with Barry is actually trying to also train others to do that. So we actually have a leadership retreat happening in October in Northern Ireland, and that's for people who are leaders or want to be leaders within kind of like congregations, whether that's youth work or pastors or songwriters or worship leaders who want to get very practical about what this liturgy looks like. So that's something that we're going to be working on together.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting, because that's the first time, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always been a thread in whether it's Wake or Spark or any of the things that you've done and I've done. There's always this attempt to try and say, this can live in places, but the idea of actually having a leadership gathering specifically to help people think through, I think really probably mostly the obstacles and the challenges of how that might look, which on one level I don't think is as difficult as it might appear.
Yeah, and that's part of it. It's almost, I want to demystify it. that some of these ideas are so complicated, and you've got Hegel and you've got Lacan and you've got like the ideas of the drive and all this, that you go like, oh my goodness, what does it look like to create a liturgy? And actually once you demystify it, it's not that difficult, and I want to show people how it's done.
I mean, if you think about it, if you take confessional Christianity, eschatology, Christology, all the central concepts, they're not so easy when you dig down. They're not. It's not like, oh yeah, that's a cheese sandwich, and you're trying to build like this big ridiculous thing with multiple layers. I mean, there is a complexity to any idea that really attempts to grapple meaningfully with it, with being a subject, being alive on Earth. And part of it is if you go, for instance, if you go to seminary, or you go into any discipline, you have to learn a new language. It doesn't matter what it is. This and that operates on a couple of levels, because I had friends, many years ago, they made a kind of a late night television show for Christian television, and one of the things they did was they had a whole infomercial on how to do Christian speak. On a very vernacular level, like good fellowshipping with your brother. I mean, it's quite funny at the time, but every discipline has a theoretical language and then a vernacular language. Christianity is no different, and really all it is learning how to use those concepts and then translate them into everyday language. And I don't think it's that difficult once you understand the essence of what's being talked about.
So that's very much what we're going to be doing in various ways in the next lot of years, working together on that. And in terms of I like the way you kind of talk about the vulgarizing side of it, the intellectual side of it. So like in physics and mathematics, we all have these languages, and we're dealing with quite an abstract language, but they're vulgarizing, meaning in the sense of putting something in the common language. One of the ways to put this into the common language in a way is to say that for both of us, even early on, I want to ask you about this in your own life actually, but even early on, I think both of us had a sense in which doubt, complexity, unknowing were important elements of being human, of being a subject. And that notion has developed and deepened for us both. And in terms of what radical theology is, something I've talked about a lot, but the movement from the idea that we have doubts about things to there is a type of unknowing within reality itself, something we've talked a lot about. But right from the beginning, even whenever you first entered into kind of the religious world, would you say that you had a certain sensitivity to the importance of doubt and unknowing?
I think.
Or did that come later?
No. I think it was latent in me. Just in life in general. The challenge was when I entered into the river of Christianity, there was a sense in which those things weren't accounted for. It was like it was always the invocation was always well, if you're doubting, you don't have faith, and what you need to have is faith, and faith will see you through and help you overcome your doubts, and you can know if you sort of come of age in Protestantism, there's this very clear sense that it's constructed in a very modern way, which basically sort of says we're humans, that it's an anthropocentric world, so you can know it all and you can work it out, so you can understand the character of God and the nature of God and all that stuff. And that was the problem for me, is that it felt like I'm not even sure that I was trying to resolve doubt particularly. I thought I was looking for I thought I needed a meaning structure to account for my own melancholy and my own sort of depressive tendency, and the sense in which I didn't think I had what was necessary inside me to navigate and negotiate that. So that part of Christianity initially was a bit of an appeal, but I always was like, well, how can it be so certain? I mean, from the very get-go, and so part of the for me, part of the process, or I don't know, the journey, trajectory, or whatever you want to call it, was coming to terms actually with finding ways to make room for what I actually already knew, but repressed and suppressed in the name of God, if you like, or faithfulness to this idea of God.
And like this is, and very important here, is that this is mirrored in contemporary society, what's called ideology. One way of describing ideology is an attempt to cover over the fractures and fissures within our system. So what ideology does is that it says, here's a system, whatever system, doesn't matter, here's a system, this is the way it should be, this is the way it always eternally is, this is justified by God or by nature or by reason. So it can be a political system, it can be an economic system, feudalism, capitalism, slavery. The ideology gives you a system and says this is the way things should be, and when it's not working, it gives you reasons that are contingent of why it doesn't work, that can be gotten rid of. And what ideology attempts to prevent you from seeing is the inherent ontological contradictions within a given system. And so interestingly, I think Christianity is like confessional Christianity and religion is a great training ground, because what's called idolatry in the religious tradition, but is that this idea of having an answer to everything, covering over the cracks, seeing that everything is a kind of a non-antagonistic whole, that us working that through in religion, it's not that's what's happening in the secular world. Like that happens everywhere.
Well, it happens in life.
It happens in life. Yeah.
The challenge with religion is religion presents itself as a particular kind of total project that eradicates all the questionable all the fishes. Even if you think about, you go back to when you used to listen to sermons and stuff like that, because I think inscribed in even the Gospels, those fishes are actually all in there.
Yes, and that's
even like the sort of famous thing where the guy comes to Jesus and he wants healing for his daughter. I believe, help my unbelief. I mean, there's a fissure there.
Yes.
But quite often within traditional Christianity, that gets explained as, oh no, that's actually a deeper level of level of faith.
Yes.
So the fissures get. The fissures become actually a means by which you prove your own totalizing thing, and
they become contingent, and they become like lack becomes loss, and they become explainable. Absolutely,
everything becomes explainable. And
the thing is, mind you, like, because I think you're absolutely right, and what Barry's touching on as well, which we'll get into, is how in the very heart of this tradition might be the tools to overcome it, but one of my thoughts on this is religion has been particularly good at this, right?
Yeah.
But not anymore. So it's like, I almost wonder whether the problem with kind of religious Christianity, and I'm just thinking out loud here, is that for many years it was very dominant in culture. And even after the Enlightenment, yes, it worked. And even after the Enlightenment, it hung on for a long time. But now increasingly, the more persuasive totalizing discourses are now the discourses you find more within the kind of techno world, within kind of or within the drug world of LA. So whether it's San Francisco's kind of tech world or LA's drug culture, that actually religion, it's not that it doesn't still try to cover over the fissures, it's just for most kind of thoughtful, intelligent, rational people, they don't fall for it as much, but they do fall for the other stuff.
You could say that the project of enlightenment has shifted from the sort of particularly religious to the secularly
Yes.
religious, whether it's through psychedelics or hallucinogenics or
Because
or,
now,
or technology itself.
If someone turns up at the door now with a tract saying, "Here's a way for you to live forever," we might laugh, but then we open Time magazine and read an article about how they might cure
uploading your consciousness,
and we find that persuasive. And it's not they're both. It's just that one used to be persuasive and is still persuasive to some people, but in terms of the kind of cultural centers, it's like religion in terms of kind of Christianity and other religions are less persuasive at a cultural level. And that's what's interesting to me.
Although I completely agree. There's this weird thing happening at the moment, though. This kind of
trad revival? No.
The sort of conservative Christian revival, and which seems to me to mirror the new kind of sanctimoniousness that is in culture as well. But I think you're right. I think in general, what used to work doesn't work anymore.
And it's funny, like the trad revival, which I think is really, really interesting, is it is less belief focused. So take someone like Jordan Peterson as an example of that. Peterson is more talking about the kind of the meaning in the text and the Jungian reading of the text, and likes the literalism of the text, but still, it was funny, I was watching him with Cosmic Skeptic recently, and Cosmic Skeptic, who I like a lot, I think he's smart, intelligent, good guy, but he's very young, but he was he was pushing Peterson on whether he believed in a literal resurrection. And I thought Peterson's answer was very good, in that Peterson was like, no, I'm upholding the belief in a literal resurrection. But what Peterson was doing was he was still not saying he believed in a literal resurrection, but he said, what I like about the belief in the literal resurrection is it's that it valorizes the body. It's not Gnostic, it's not about something else. And again, what I find interesting about that is how actually it's not just a case of do you believe it or do you not. You can actually believe, say, in a literal resurrection without believing it, because you believe that the belief itself captures something.
It has something.
So Peterson's, so I think that trad revival is more that it binds people's anxiety, it gives meaning. But I see a lot of people here go in that direction. It's different from conservative evangelicalism.
I mean, it's always different because the times have shifted. So the way we even conceive of those things, I'm older than you, so my sort of experience even going into Christianity was slightly. It's on the same spectrum. But probably I'd say perhaps on the front end, and you were on a latter end of it. And so now the way people talk about even things like belief is different than 20 years ago. It would, if you think about, I know you've been doing your book study on your first book and critiquing your first book, but if you think about what you were saying then, which was your own personal stuff, but also within the context of what was happening, most of that stuff isn't happening in the same way anymore. It's happening, as you said, like with the trad thing, where it's the belief in the belief, not the belief itself. So it's not, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? It's like, do you believe in the belief of the resurrection of Jesus? And then you can go, I believe in that because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it actually is a mechanism by which you actually don't have to hold a belief. You just hold a belief about a belief.
Which I would say, funnily enough, is has kind of always been the mode of belief, right? That's actually kind of, in one sense, a fidelity. Like we kind of get it wrong. We almost have a psychotic view of belief when we literally have to believe our belief. Like when someone says, "How are you doing?" We know, unless you suffer from like psychosis or whatever, and then that question is difficult, or autism, because the person's lying. They're asking how are you, but they don't really know they're not really asking how you are. But mostly we know that the true answer is to say I'm doing okay, right? The true answer is to lie, right? You might be having a shit day, but if you told the truth, you're weirdly lying, but by lying you're kind of telling the truth, which can itself lead to a deeper conversation, right? But you can't just jump in there.
Well, especially at the coffee shop, you can do it. Exactly. You can do it with a friend, but your friend doesn't actually want to play the game of the
yes. And only occasionally with your friends, still only one time out of 20, you know, like I don't want you to answer truthfully all the time, just
let me tell you how I'm doing.
Exactly. Like actually, you know, I just had a friend around today, and sadly he had a friend passed away. We were chatting to him, and that was a case where with this friend of mine, Jimmy, we see each other all the time. How's it going? Oh, it's fine. And This was the one day where I could go, how are you doing? And he'd go, not great.
Yeah.
And that was the moment when that was possible.
Yeah.
But it's not what you want every single time. But it means that whenever it does happen, you can have that conversation. And you know, the next time I see him, we'll play the game. But you have those moments.
Yeah. Anyway, so to circle sort of back around, so I harbored these unsayable things, really, or at least at the time, it seemed to me they were unsayable within the confines of where I was. You know, doubt, the sense that there's an inherent unknowing and uncertainty to life that you really actually don't. You need to come to terms with, not fill up or cover over or explain away. It took some time to get to being able to achieve that. You know what I mean? And for me, and I think similarly to you, really, it began as a sort of journey through parts of Christianity that weren't common to the environments that we're in, so the mystics and stuff like that. I mean, I remember I was really caught up. I read, I don't even know where I read it, but you know, there's that quote by Dostoevsky. You know, my hallelujah is not the hallelujah of a child. My hallelujah is born in the crucible of doubt. And that was a beginning thing for me. It was like, oh, wait a minute. You know, that's not what I'm sort of experiencing, and that's not what I'm being told. But that has a resonance to me.
Yes.
That I was like, oh, so there is space here for something else and something other. Yeah. And of course, different century, different time, different era, different thing, and it obviously meant something entirely different to him than it meant to me then, and even would mean to me now. Yeah. But so there's room for this stuff, you know, and you find these little bits and pieces, I think, just breadcrumbs, if you like, that you can sort of pass your way through. Yeah. And I think it was re-expanding my exploration and reading universe that helped me sort of go, okay, so this is sort of, there is room, but now what? You know what I mean? And at first I think it's like, you still think you can exist within the horizon of the confessional. That takes a little longer to sort of come out the other side of it.
One thing I think both of us have been influenced by Simone Weil, or Weil. Do you pronounce the L? I don't know. I never know whether to pronounce the L or not, but I'll say Simone Weil. But
I used to say Simone Weil for a long time because I'm just a literalist. You know what I mean? Because you know, French. You know, so Weil.
Well, you speak French, I don't, so you'll know Weil.
My French is shit, though.
But I've been reading her recently, and reading a book by Lisa McCullough, who's very good on it. But she's one of the thinkers who really sees this idea of contradiction or impossibility or inherent unknowing as part woven into the very fabric of individuals' life and the divine, the absolute, or just ultimate reality. And you know, she makes, I think it's an important distinction between kind of like superficial contradictions and unknowing that can be overcome. So there's so much stuff we don't know, and we have to, you know, we are both advocates of the intellectual life. The intellectual life is about overcoming unknowing, right? We want to overcome it, we want to know more. And then Simone Weil talks about how, but we hit, and this is very similar to Hegel and this idea of absolute knowledge, but Weil talks about how you hit on an unknowing that isn't contingent. that is a rung that cannot be climbed beyond.
Yeah.
And at that point she was like, and then you, in a sense, you contemplate it.
Yeah.
And for her the name for this was crucifixion, because it's the ultimate contradiction,
Yeah.
the eternal and the temporal coming together, that which cannot die dying.
Yeah.
And communion, the Eucharist, was a meal around the contradiction.
Yeah.
But what was beautiful about, and what is beautiful about her work, is that there's the part of the work of life
Yeah.
is to encounter and be attentive to a type of impossibility or inherent doubt and unknowing that permeates everything.
Yeah, and it weirdly, I don't think I was ever actually afraid of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's why I've said many times that in spite of my basically long adult journey into religion and Christianity and stuff, I was never actually looking for God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
you just didn't know that necessarily.
I just didn't know that.
Exactly. I was
because I was told, because
Yeah.
my initial foray or experience of Christianity had nothing at all to do with Christians or the church. But once I got there, suddenly I was told, and I was like, oh, okay, God, okay, we'll bring God into the equation, but it took a while to go, wait, actually, no, I don't need that component, you know what I mean, and
then even, yes, that's the same journey as to me, and then we are now in our more mature work, I think. We're in our more mature work. Who knows? Yes. Is that then God can become a signifier for the doubt and the lack itself. So there's a point where God is the kind of what covers over, like an ideological covering over of the doubt or the lack. Then God becomes superfluous to this. But what's really interesting is in the work of people like, in the past, people like Hegel or Weil, but also Zizek today and McGowan and others, is that we need a signifier for nothing. And actually, the signifier God could potentially be the name, not for that which covers over the unknowing, not in terms of Pascal, not that God is the thing that fills the void, but God is the name of the void itself. Which I actually weirdly had in my first book. I mean, I'm critical of my first book, and I just, as Barry said, did a critique of it. But there were moments that I thought I hit something.
That's the interesting thing, though, is when the great gift I think of getting a bit older is you look back and you realize that there were hints of things that you then spent a decade trying to work out, and it was actually latent there.
Yes.
You just didn't realize it. I don't know, some people would say, oh, you weren't ready to know it or whatever. I just think sometimes the unconscious is just picking up on shit, and it takes you a while to catch up with. Which
is why, absolutely, because Zizek talks about this, I think, brilliantly, and it's a very Hegelian point, which is why your early work isn't the key to understanding your later work. More often than not, your later work is the key to understanding your early work, because only when you get to the mature work can you then find what was latent, what was in the soil of the early work, which never could quite be seen until it reached maturity.
It's very abstract and very naive, but I told you about that school report that my brother found, from when I was 8 years and 5 months old. And the three main subjects were music, art, and religion.
Yes, it was
something.
there.
It was there. It was, and I was 8 years old. So I'm not saying it was, but I'm just saying there are things that lurk.
Yes,
and I do think that when you have distance and you look back, you see things as you did, like that there's a reference to an idea about.
Yes.
The name of God, or the idea of God, that 20 years later you're going,
and it's retroactively created. I mean, one of the examples Zizek uses is like when a writer like Kafka appears, Kafka is so new that you can't really put him in the history of writing, but then once he's done his body of work, it is integrated, and then you find antecedents, but in a way what you discover in the past that's Kafkaesque only becomes Kafkaesque
because
in light of Kafka. So and this is why, but as an aside, but an important aside for some people, is a lot of Bonhoeffer scholars I completely disagree with, who think that his later work has to be understood in relation to his earlier work. I think you can only understand Bonhoeffer by reading the letters and papers from prison. I think it's that offers the key to the early work, and the true Bonhoeffer is the radical Bonhoeffer. But again, it only was in light of those fragments that you could see the really good stuff.
No, you're right. Kafka's an interesting example, and I think Kafka's really helpful with the whole idea of how to think about putting radical theology into practice. You know, when I was in Prague last year, and I was doing this thing on. It was a week-long course, so every day it was radical theology in the city, and I used Prague, the city itself, as a way of talking about some elements of radical theology. So we went to this museum of alchemy and talked about, you know, that whole thing. And one of the things we did, we went to the Kafka museum, and after that I sort of went back and read more Kafka, and I got his book, the Zurau Aphorisms, which is a book of little sentences that he wrote, and there's a single sentence in there that it's called The Leopards in the Temple, and it's this story of like there's people in this temple, and leopards come in and they start to drink from all the drink and eat from the bowls that contain all the holy artifacts, and the people in the temple sort of don't react, and the leopards keep coming back until they get incorporated into the ritual itself.
Oh wow, yeah.
I think it's a really brilliant analogy for how to think about the enaction of pyrotheology, radical theology within the confines of communion of people. It's like leopards in the temple.
Yeah.
It's like it's this external thing that actually then becomes a way in which the ritual itself becomes desacralized, if you like, and then sacralized in a new way, and it becomes a part of a new system of. I don't know. That's very just good. On the top of my head, but that is something to talk about in October.
That's how a lot of things progress in terms of mistakes that move things forward, like cheese goes off and then it becomes blue cheese. Wine's fermented, becomes champagne. Like I don't know, somebody's written on this, but the history of French food is often these mistakes that are external to the system then become the innovation within the system.
The same is true in music.
And art.
The early history of rock and roll is a history of mistakes. The drum beat that got left on the opening of Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, which was on another piece. It was from another song on a piece of tape, but it like suddenly brings in the new, and it was actually simply a mistake.
This is a great way to understand the unconscious, in that the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, isn't something substantive. It's almost like a chaotic disruption that creates something new. So you can never name the mistake. Like you can name what arises out of the mistake. But in art movements and in music movements and in food and all of this thing, something disrupts, and that disruption creates something new, and the disruption itself doesn't exist. It insists. It's a failure. A failure that is productive. And again, that I think is a great way to understand the Freudian unconscious. And in terms of radical theology, this is in a sense, we talk about there is an eternal dimension of nothing, or of crisis, or of chaos, or antagonism that is in the heart of everything. And death of God theology is in a sense the naming of that asymmetry, that antagonism, as the absolute, because it's almost like the generative power. It is and that's why I'm playing around with the term how nothing comes out of something, because in philosophy traditionally there's the question, how does something come out of nothing? But on a more fundamental level for us, the question is, how does nothing arise out of something? How does, in terms of like, and you'd imagine all of existence being a thing, right? So how does it change? How does something that is just pure thingness, pure something, how does it change? How does nothing, a kind of a rupture and a lack, get introduced that moves things? And I think there's a way to answer that, but the almost within Lacanian psychoanalysis and in Hegelian philosophy, there's an idea that the development from animals to humans isn't actually that something is added, it's that something is removed. That communication is what animals have, like a certain sound needs to mate or danger or whatever. So there's a one-to-one communication, but language arises when there's miscommunication, when something drops out and a signifier is created that can be misinterpreted. So weirdly, language is not so much communication plus something, it's communication minus something.
And I mean, if you think about this, I mean, you could think about this in a very kind of everyday way and think about how often we misunderstand what's being said. We just miscommunicate all the time. You know, as human beings, we always talk about better communication, but really we're just addressing the fact that communication is always miscommunication.
And all the amazing stuff that comes out of that, like that it's all the bad stuff as well, but the miscommunication is where conversation, because in one sense, but you only write a second book because your first book didn't quite name everything you wanted to name, like it failed. You only keep speaking. As a public speaker, I'm always trying to do a talk that nails things,
and you never do.
I never do, and there's always miscommunication on one side and misinterpretation on the other, but that provides all of the grist for new stuff.
And I mean, it's really, you know, this is I mean, this is, I think, in some ways, the sort of genius of Freud and the idea of, you know, analysis and the talking cure is that, you know, it's only on the couch that you actually don't miscommunicate, that you actually, you don't lie, you don't withhold, you don't finesse, you know, you just say the unsayable of your own life, and you learn then to come to terms with your own self. But if you think about it, you know, it's that moment in a given day where you're actually communicating.
Yes, and the interesting thing
and yet you're not talking to anybody except the therapist, you know, or the analyst. And I don't know. I think that's just kind of an interesting thing. That the rest, what that really implies, is that the rest of the day you're going through miscommunicating.
Absolutely.
Really.
And then in analysis, yes, you say through free association, you just say what you say, but then what you discover is there is another saying in what is said. So you say a word like what the analyst does, as you know, is maybe punctuate your word. So you say something like, I felt nothing negative, I felt nothing bad about how that person spoke to me, and the person said you felt nothing. So what the analyst does there is they punctuate. So you said, I felt nothing bad about what that person said. Then they almost put a full stop and say, you felt nothing.
Let's address the nothing.
And they're doing that often through not understanding. So it's not that they see something you don't.
No.
They're just taking a punt at breaking up your discourse in such a way that you realize that you're saying something else, like, oh, I feel nothing. It's not that, oh, I felt nothing as in I was passively, I didn't care, but, oh, I feel so empty that I can't feel anything at all. And that only becomes visible because the discourse was punctuated, and you realize in your very speaking something else is being spoken. Fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Anyway, I want to go back to your thing about God, because I think that's a really interesting thing. Not reclaiming God, but reclaiming the word, the signifier. What do you think? What do you think that's? How do you see that playing out in?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Because
I know what I'm trying to say. I'm just miscommunicating it.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. For me, the signifier God has always, it is what's called a master signifier,
right.
in that it's always been a signifier that defines something that cannot be signified. That's one of the traditional definitions of God, right? The term God references something that cannot be referred to, something that cannot be conceptualized. So and that's why they call it master signifier. It's a word that you can't really define, but that corrals definitions and words and phrases.
Everybody tries to define it.
And it creates a discourse. So justice, democracy, freedom. We have lots of master signifiers. So these are terms that we're and again, in terms of a psychotic doesn't have master signifiers. Sometimes there's nothing that locks words together, so they can just go off and use words and without almost. If you listen to somebody who's got a psychotic break, no hierarchy. So someone in a psychotic break, you can't really follow it because the words don't have don't have a what's it called caption point. There's a word Lacan uses, but a quilting point. That's it. So in a way, this is not something. What we're doing with the term God is not anything new. There's always been this sense in which it's not just there's something and there's nothing, but there's a nothing that is something. We need to signify nothingness itself. Nothingness requires signification. Obviously, the number 0 is a signification of nothing, and imaginary numbers, etc., etc. So, in one sense, we're taking this idea and we're exploring it we're trying to push it as far as it will go. That this signifier signifies a type of impossibility or lack, and that is always been in continuity with the religious tradition, but also ultimately critiques it and kind of like breaks it from within.
Because I think where there are sort of breaking points along the way. I think when you're in this sort of movement, coming to terms with those things, and I sort of got to mystery. You know what I mean? You get to mystery and you feel a little bit of breathing room for a while. Now I've got a little bit of doubt going. You know what I mean? And the unknown and stuff like that. But then you realize that within classical mysticism, there is a tendency then to try and shape what that.
There's a hyper presence. There's a hyper substantive. Substantive reality.
So and that became so for a while. You could live on the breath of the mystics. God, rid me of God. You can read Meister Eckhart. You can dig into the mystics and the cloud of unknowing and all those things, but then you sort of realize that there's still something else at work,
which I think is in Eckhart. Funny you mentioned Eckhart. He's the best, and in Eckhart you do get this sense of a divine rupture. So out of all the mystics, I think you've been influenced by Eckhart as well, but out of all the mystics, Eckhart's the one who I think pushes in this direction the most. So it's interesting then to sort of get there, and then it's this space where that for me is the space where radical theology comes into its own. That's actually where you literally go out into space. That's where you go out into nothing. And for you, for me and for both of us, there were a lot of kind of intellectual influences. People like Simone, but for you more than me, there were also artistic influences. So this is personally selfish. I want to know a few, but what either musicians or painters do you think are influential in these kind of radical ideas that have kind of like helped you?
You know, it's interesting because some of them were through their an awareness of their processes. So, you know, I've talked about at Wake, the painter Mark Tansey, you know, with his philosopher's wheel and, you know, and his kind of approach really through continental philosophy and weird words, creating these sort of collage paintings where he subtracts, you know, he literally takes things away rather than puts things on a canvas. And that was really helpful for me in terms of subtracting from the tyranny of a belief system. Like, you know, taking, like, oh, don't need that one, don't need, you know, scraping it away. And the scraping away reveals what lurks underneath, you know what I mean? So it's not wiping the canvas clean. It's that it actually helps you to see what's underneath, you know. It's a bit like, again, the sort of psychoanalytic process, you know. The word interruption reveals what you've actually painted with your words. The words aren't telling the story. It's nothing bad. No. It's the nothing. Let's scrape that away and see what we get there. So there are painters like that, and then there are other painters. You know, last week we went and looked at Caravaggio, and that was really more. That was much more the content of the paintings and the way in which he sought to express the inexpressible in art, to say the unsayable by inscribing brute humanity into the paintings, to allow the ordinary and the mundane to clash with the inexplicable, you know, otherness. And then, you know, and then in the music world, I mean, Bowie was very influential because I think Bowie was on this constant journey to nowhere. The adventure of constant, like, no fixed identity. None whatsoever. You know, the idea that identity actually is an obstacle. You know, as somebody said, it's the secret source of capitalism. You know, fixed identity is like, it becomes this real stumbling block. I think, and so when I sort of encountered Bowie, I was like, fuck, there's something here. You know what I mean? It was blasting through. So, because the interesting thing about art is that it's not dogmatic, and it's not a representational. It's not a presentational language. You know, a dog doesn't have to be a dog in music or in painting. And I think it was really a realization, because for a while I thought that was a part of my life that I was interested in, but it had nothing at all to do with this. You know what I mean? Like, that this was a separate conversation. Like, if I was talking about religion, it was all these ideas, but this had nothing to do with it. And it was realizing that there was something in this world where you don't get the singular interpretation of events. What you get is the moment something happens that you can't, because, you know, think about it, it's really weird to stand in front of a painting and be moved by it. Why really? I mean, on one level it's like you can break it all down to the rational elements and go, well, there's something inexplicable here. Same with music. It gives you, to me, the arts gave some sense of the thing that I thought religion was doing a bad job of expressing for me, which is that you reach a point where you have to come to terms with the inability to actually fully comprehend, and yet that's the place to be.
Yeah, which is obviously not all music. There's certain musicians who are, you could almost say,
and it's highly subjective.
Yeah.
Because you like one thing, I like another thing.
But it's not about liking a way. Because I like pop music. It's like,
Well, there are, and I don't want to diminish whoever's in the music business or the art business or whatever, but I think people are involved for very, very different reasons, and have very different drives into what they're doing. And I've always been fascinated by the artists that plumb the questions of, not just the questions, because the question of subjectivity is almost a dumb thing in and of itself, you know what I mean? But they understand, they're on a trajectory that they don't know where they're going either.
Yeah.
But they know that wherever they're going, it's like famously Bowie said, "I don't know where I'm going, but it'll be all right."
Yeah. There's I
don't know if I'm answering your question, really.
Yeah, no, I think so. So Simone Weil, one of the things I like in her work is she makes a distinction between will and attention.
Yeah.
Which is similar to something I'm interested in, where I make a distinction between self-help and grace. But will is the movement. So when you will something, you move from A to B, you move forward. So will is about movement, which is all we need in our lives, right? So will is about movement. Attention is about intense observation for her. So instead of like trying to move from somewhere, attention is you observe. You observe yourself, you observe that. And for her, love is attention. When you give attention to someone.
I love that about Simone Weil.
Oh yeah, and you give love. Love and attention are so intertwined. For me, like one of the things you're describing here, and it's very, I think, very insightful in terms of how change happens, is for me, certain artists and musicians have that profound sense of attention. So there's certain kind of music that's all about moving forward and achieving things and getting things and all of that. But then there's certain music that's just attentive to the difficulties and the contradictions and the struggles and the beauties of life. They're just like, they're not trying, they're on a road to nowhere. It's not about getting from here to here, because we all die, we all get to the same place.
We all get to the same place.
As Kierkegaard says, like you all get the same 6 foot of land at the end of the day. If you're really rich, you might get 8 foot, right? But in the cemetery,
you might get a vault.
You might get a vault, right? So in terms of thinking about, I want to achieve this, I want to achieve that, I want to achieve the other, right? But for Weil, it's like, it's attention. And for her, when you are attentive to life, you ultimately become attentive to the contradictions.
Yeah. And you can't help it. Because you see.
Yes. Whereas Will almost tries to cover over the contradictions, because Will kind of goes, I want to write this book, I want to do this, I want to do that, almost as if, and if I get that, everything will not be everything will be great. Yeah. Attentiveness is like, you see through all of that, and you somehow allow space for that.
Yeah, and I think this is what I sort of got from art very early on, and it just was, again, a question of learning how to put these things together in your own life. When I said I thought I needed a big meaning structure to sort myself out, it's because I didn't know how to address the various bits of me that seemed to be divergent but really weren't.
Yes.
I just didn't know how to pull them together and realize that I could see in a Francis Bacon painting, just the brute, violent chaos of, just slamming oil paint on this thing in anger and contempt, and painting, pictures of popes, but with that scene from the battleship Potemkin, where the woman gets the glass in her eyes cracked and she's screaming, and that becomes the face of the Pope. You just go straight into the void of what it means to be human, or Caravaggio, who like, was always in a fight, always on the run, and never rehearsed a painting.
Yes.
Didn't calculate it all down, just started painting on canvas. Or Bowie, who would had initially, took inspiration from like Dada practices and wrote out words and then cut them up and put them in a plastic bag, and those were the songs, and then got a computer program to do that, and yet out of that you get this,
Yes.
or going, I'm going to show up in a dress tonight, not for effect,
Yes.
but because I'm just exposing something.
Yes. Yes.
Exposing all these things, and you realize that these are just, if you pay attention, this we're being invited to see.
Yeah.
We're invited to see something.
This gets like this, and this is a good way to begin to conclude, I guess, is you're expressing beautifully what we were trying to do with Icon originally, which was to create a space of attention to that chaos that is within and permeates everything, and not kind of valorizing it, i.e., because in one sense you can't live in that, you live in the everyday life, but you need these spaces in your life once a week or once a month, whenever it is, these spaces where you become attentive to that chaotic events, that stuff, and that's where transformation happens. Even in analysis, the transformation often happens when you break up your words and you're thrown in a new direction. You suddenly kind of like, you see everything in a slightly different way. And this is why this idea of will and attention is so key to me, is that in the world where we're going from one thing to another and we're trying to progress, and Julie Reich's negative psychoanalysis, I think, is part of the family here, right? Is in the family, in that these are all ways of saying, just let's become attentive to the reality that we are participating in. Become attentive to it so much, so attentive that we become attentive and we see that chaotic dimension, and that we make space for that in our lives, and then you don't have to do anything else.
That's one of the I've talked about this a lot, and it becomes a little bit of a joke really, but one of the best examples of this to me is to see Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds play live, because they're a band that they're incredibly talented musicians, but they live constantly on the edge of chaos. It can all go wrong. And Nick Cave is self-admittedly not the world's greatest singer. He's got Warren Ellis who plays the violin, and it's not always in tune. And there's a thing that happens, but I remember one of the first times I went with my brother to see them once, and my brother's very rational, not interested in, just doesn't go there, with so many things that I'm interested in, but we share music, and we went to see Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds at the Brixton Academy, and it was just apocalyptic. They only played with black and with white light for a start, so it's like these big shadows on the wall. My brother leaned over at one point and went, "This is the house band in hell." You know what I mean? And they play this thing, and then there's an eruption in their songs. It's literally an eruption. It's like they're playing along, and suddenly it just goes boom, and then it just all gets pulled back in. And that moment though is a reminder. It's just it's a bit like Radiohead, in Creep. That the song that made them. Johnny Greenwood does that thing with his guitar. Nobody ever heard that before. You know what I mean? And it changes that song from just another emo rock song into something that heralded something that nobody really encountered.
You said that is it true with AC/DC in the early days that there was a certain chaos that was in every concert that you could almost have collapsed?
Yeah, because that's the I mean, to me, that's the transgressive nature of art anyway. It always takes you to the edge of chaos, which is, I think, the ultimate sense of what it means to be human anyway. We create all of our ways of holding back the chaos.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And the ways that we purge that chaos. But
somehow in their spirit in the early days, there was like this.
Yeah,
they touched
it's
it.
Just energy, you know.
I mean, even with Icon, by the way, Johnny McEwen, who is an artist who was very involved, he would build into what we were doing places where failure could happen. So, for example, whether it was we did these events in a bar, we didn't close it off or anything, so we were doing these really weird artistic events, often with people there who were nothing to do with it, but creating opportunities for chaos and unpredictability and novelty and spontaneity to erupt. And sometimes it failed, sometimes it didn't work at all.
No, I mean, I remember, you know, years and years ago, before it was a thing, you know, I knew a couple of painters, so I said, you know, you should just paint some stuff. And this is when it was a bit more churchy still, you know. I'm like, why don't we just like hang a couple of canvases and you can like paint, you know. It was sort of disastrous, but it also heralded. And you know, I played with the same musicians probably for 20 years. We never rehearsed once. Purposefully, really. Like, let's just see what happens, you know. And sometimes it was shit.
I know, some of the Icon things we did. I had a friend of mine, he read my first book and he said, Pete, I read those gatherings you had. You know, they sounded great. He said, they were never that good when I was there. He said some of them
they weren't really.
Yeah, you know,
because that was the recipe.
Yeah,
the chaos you can't put the chaos. You can't write the chaos in.
You can just allow.
You can just allow a little bit of space for it. Exactly,
that's it. Kind of create a semi-permeable membrane where it can arise, and that's very key. It's like you can't make the unconscious show itself. You can't make the chaos. You can't write that into the text, but you can try to find a way in which you allow it to do its work.
Yeah,
and
you have to be willing for it not to. And you just keep going.
Yes,
that's the real thing. Is it doesn't, if it works every time, then it's not what you're aiming for.
Exactly.
If it's predictable and it's inscribed in.
So you've even got to enjoy the failure. You've got to not just tolerate it, but kind of enjoy it and kind of laugh about it. Because if it works all the time, it's not working. Because there's something about not working. In terms of relationship, I mean, this is something I'm very interested in, is that relationships don't work or not work. Relationships that work in a way that don't work. And in a bad way or a good way. It's like, if a relationship works perfectly, people are going to get bored and they're going to break up. If it's not working, they're going to move away. What happens is when something isn't working in a way that works for you, I'd say negatively, that means you stay in an abusive relationship because you're getting something from it. But in good, healthy relationships, there's also something that doesn't work, but it doesn't work in a way that works beautifully. And that's key.
No, it's very key. I mean, that's probably another whole conversation about, you know, the way desire functions, you know, and you know, we want what we want because we want it, and there's really no explanation that's going to satisfy someone else that doesn't you know, want your desire, but I do think that's something to come back to, that whole thing of, you know, the functional versus non-dysfunctional relationship and what everybody gets from those, and the possibilities.
Great. Well, here, let's stop there. We can have that conversation next time.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for tuning in, and
see you in October.
See you in October.